Welcome back to another FPL video and podcast. This will be the updated Wildcard Team for Gameweek 21 with several key changes compared to the last edition, which I released a couple of days ago. Be sure to check it out. The same goes for all the other content like the transfer tips, the updated version, and the team selection is headed your way. Everything you need to know for Gameweek 21 is covered across all of my videos, and the deadline stream on Tuesday will cover any additional updates in terms of injuries, suspensions, and much more. So be sure not to miss it by smashing the like button of this video and subscribing if you're new. Our aim is to get this to 200 likes and to keep on pushing towards new goals like 32,000 subscribers. We hit 30k in December, and also in the first few days of 2025 we hit 31,000. So thank you very much for your support. It's massively appreciated as always, and let's be sure to hit new milestones in 2025. And you can check out all my links in the description below. My Twitter and Instagram, DylanRCM. There's also my Blue Sky. You can find me by typing FPL Dylan. The Discord server, FPL League Drafthound, as well as Spotify can also be found in the description. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it. My squad value is 104.2 million, but in terms of pure spending power, by removing every single player from my squad, I would have 102.1 million. Some of you watching might have even more or even less, but despite what your budget is, I'll be covering alternatives in each position, so you've got a good idea of the pool of players you should be investing in, and if not, some of the teams you should be covering either defensively or in the attacking areas. Let's start off though with the two goalkeepers. We've got two standouts in this position for the number one spot, and not much has changed in that regard. It's extremely close to call when you're talking about the best goalkeeper between Sells and Pickford. They're undoubtedly the best in terms of value. They've got the highest ceiling because of saves and bonus points, and both of their clubs are solid defensively. Nottingham Forest are third in the Premier League table, only behind Arsenal on goal difference, and they've won 6 consecutive games, whilst Everton have a new manager in David Moyes, an old figurehead there who has been at the club before, and that's going to be quite exciting to see how things go for the Toffees. But it's very close between those two, Sells and Pickford. I think there's a big gap between them and the rest of the goalkeepers, which includes David Raya, who remains third in my podium, but I think in terms of value, he's nowhere near the levels of Sells or Pickford. Now, Sells faces Liverpool at home this week, but then it's Southampton, and afterwards you've got some mixed bag fixtures, and Nottingham Forest are bottom of the fixture difficulty rating over the next 12 game weeks, whilst Everton could have a double in game week 24 or 25, which would actually push them top even above Liverpool. So it is a very close call. In my original wildcard video, I discussed Pickford, but I have to say it's neck and neck between Sells and Pickford at the moment. And if you go for Sells in goal, you might also want Mikalenko or Ashley Young to cover Everton defensively, or vice versa. Go for Pickford in goal, and then somebody like Aina, Milenkovic, or Nico Williams, who's 4.3 million, and he has started 6 consecutive games for Nottingham Forest in the Premier League. But in this wildcard team, I've gone for Sells. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But the backup goalkeeper is a bit more interesting. I've gone for Fabianski, who started against Aston Villa in their 2-1 defeat in the FA Cup, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's the first choice goalkeeper for Graham Potter, who is the new manager at West Ham. It would not surprise me if Areola was between the sticks in Game Week 21, so be very careful with your choice of backup goalkeeper. And either way, it's all about your main choice, either Sells, Pickford or Raya, and you could also go for the likes of Alisson or Onana, but I don't think Fabianski will come into the equation too often. Even this week, where you might consider starting him over Sells, it isn't a guarantee that the Polish 41-year-old is going to be starting in Game Week 21 against Fulham at home, so be very careful about that. I think he's still the best backup goalkeeper in the long term, should he remain number one over Areola until the end of the season. I don't think Dubravka offers a long-term solution, and with Newcastle, I think the ideal triple up there would be Isak, Gordon, and Lewis Hall. I haven't suddenly gone cold on Trent Alexander-Arnold, far from it. If you got the extra funds, it's still possibly worth going for him over Konate, but in terms of pure value and for those on a tight budget like myself, I think going for the Frenchman might be a better investment from this point onwards, and Konate is arguably more likely to start both games in a potential double than Trent Alexander-Arnold, who has Conor Bradley also competing for the same spot. And the fact that Trent started and played 60 minutes against Accrington Stanley is a bit concerning for owners, but I still think he's going to start against Forest and most games in the Premier League, despite all the transfer speculation to Real Madrid and of course that performance against Manchester United, which was terrible to say the least. With Trent, you either get brilliance or sometimes ineptitude defensively, and unfortunately for him, in Game Week 20 he cost Liverpool 2 points in my opinion, and they were held to a draw against Manchester United. But Konate played fairly well upon his comeback. He was a bit jaded towards the end of that game, which is natural considering he was out for a couple of weeks, but I think it's a good investment in that Liverpool defence. I wouldn't be looking to double up though on the Reds defensively, despite the fact that they've conceded the fewest goals and they're keeping plenty of clean sheets in general, but there has been a decline recently. I think Konate will shore things up a little bit in that regard, but I would go for Konate as your kind of third or fourth defender, and considering his price, to be fair, you would start him more often than not, but against Forest away, I don't think you necessarily should do that, and you would have other options, especially with this wildcard team. Now, one of them is going to be the expensive Gabriel, who remains one of the best defenders in this game, but Arsenal haven't been keeping clean sheets away from home. A lot of their upcoming games are at the Emirates, but they are tough games like Aston Villa and Tottenham Hotspur, so there could be a lack of clean sheets in some of those matches. But in the reverse fixtures, Arsenal were able to get the results, keep the clean sheets, and Gabriel got 15 points against Tottenham in their own stadium. Now, is that going to happen at the Emirates? Probably not, but you wouldn't discount Gabriel in any single game. He's got a very good chance of hauling against anybody. He's scored at the Etihad, at Anfield over the years, Stamford Bridge, you name it. Old Trafford is the last one to tick off that very impressive list. And when you're comparing Gabriel to maybe Trent Alexander-Arnold or Virgil van Dijk, maybe Gabriel isn't going to look as secure considering Arsenal's recent problems. They look very shaky defensively against Newcastle in their 2-0 defeat in the Carabao Cup semi-final, and also Arsenal just aren't able to translate their home form into away matches, and that's something they need to shore up in order to compete for the Premier League title. I still think Gabriel is the best defender in FPL, generally speaking, with the goal threat, the bonus points, and Arsenal's clean sheet probabilities, which is going to be higher than most teams in pretty much any given game week. Of course, it does depend on circumstances, and against Tottenham at home, he is benchable to a certain degree, but always be very careful when benching this caliber of defender. The same would go for Trent Alexander-Arnold. Now, I'm also going to go for some cheaper options here, like Lewis Hall, and despite the fact that Konate is more expensive, I'd be inclined to start Lewis Hall over Konate in most game weeks, but that's certainly subjective, and it does depend on the opposition as well. And will Newcastle keep this up and keep on winning matches, scoring a lot of goals and keeping clean sheets? I think there will be a drop-off at some stage, but their recent form is very impressive, and Hall is getting the assists, creating chances, and getting some bonus points as well. He's not the only defender to do this, with Robinson not getting many clean sheets to be fair, but he is getting assists, and in terms of defenders, he's got the most of any option there. You've also got Castagna and Joachim Andersen, who will offer cheaper alternatives, Nico Williams, who I discussed earlier, not to mention Aina and Milenkovic, as I think Forest are worth targeting defensively. But since I've got sales in this updated wildcard team, I would actually consider an Evertonian, and Mykolenko offers great value at 4.3 million. The only concern is, can he stay fit? Because he does get yellow flagged a lot and he misses the occasional game. It's happened many times this season and also in the last campaign. But when I had Mykolenko, he was actually doing fairly well for me, and then I sold him. He got back-to-back 7-pointers against Arsenal and Chelsea, and you shouldn't be too surprised by that. Will it be the same case though with David Moyes, as Sean Dyche was more of a defensive manager? That remains to be seen. I personally think Everton will score more goals and create more chances, but they'll also concede more opportunities, and therefore there will be fewer clean sheets. But it's still worth having a Mykolenko or Ashley Young, if not Jordan Pickford, as your main goalkeeper. And a new manager bounce is still very important. David Moyes knows Everton like the back of his hand. He's had a lot of experience there over the years, and I think he's going to be a good appointment for them, at least for this season. Let's see how that goes in the long term. But as I mentioned before, if you go for sales and goal, I'd still recommend an Ashley Young or Mykolenko in your defensive line. And I'd also consider an exciting defender here in Daniel Munoz, but Crystal Palace won't keep that many clean sheets, despite having a solid defence on paper with some decent centre-backs like Mark Gay and Lacroix. And also Daniel Munoz is a solid wing-back with a lot of attacking potential. He bombs forward and he gets into some very exciting positions, but it can be very frustrating owning him at times. But when it goes right, he'll get some massive hauls for you, and I think he's by far the best way of covering Crystal Palace defensively. There is a template forming, especially in the midfield. Mohamed Salah is the most owned player in FPL right now, and with good reason. 11 consecutive game weeks with a return. He's averaging 11 points per game. It's simply outstanding. This is the best start we've ever seen from a player in a Premier League season. Can he do this in the second half of the campaign? I don't think he'll go to the same level. There will be a drop-off, but it doesn't really matter what he does at this point. Any kind of sort of normality from Salah, it will probably mean some outstanding records being broken, including the most assists in the Premier League campaign. I think he's a must-have in the midfield, and I rarely say this about a player, but the form Salah is in, it's simply frightening. He has been a bit underwhelming in the last 2 games when you look at the Carabao Cup semi-final, the first leg against Tottenham, where he was up against a fairly weak defence on paper, and also against Manchester United, where he created a big chance and then scored from the penalty spot, but he wasn't that good in terms of his overall performance. But Salah, for me, is still the best midfielder and asset in the game, and there's no doubt in my mind I'd still go for him, especially with a pending double game week, which features the Merseyside derby. Next up, though, is the second best midfielder in the game in Cole Palmer, and I have discussed this before about Bryan Mbeumo being third, but there is the possibility of having a placeholder for him and then making the switch around game week 23 or 24, but I wouldn't do that sort of thing with Palmer or Salah. They should be in your setup. I know some of you might consider Erling Haaland over Palmer, and that is definitely debatable, but I just think Palmer offers far better value for money. With just 1 goal against Crystal Palace, despite also being the culprit for the Eagles' equaliser, Palmer was able to get maximum bonus points and a 10-point haul. So I just think Palmer is still the second best midfielder and asset in the game right now. That could change fairly soon, but his consistency from last season has been staggering, to say the least. I would also go for a budget option here, just to facilitate your other midfielders and forwards, and Morgan Rogers for me remains the best budget midfielder, but Amad Diallo could be another one, especially this week to invest in against Southampton at home. But we have seen a pattern with Amad Diallo, massive returns against Liverpool and Man City away from home, and then against Bournemouth and these somewhat easier fixtures on paper, Man United have really flattered to deceive, and Amad Diallo hasn't been able to influence those games to the same level. Even Wolves away, which a lot of people would have backed Man United to score in at least, Amad Diallo didn't really have any impact on that match whatsoever. I think Rodgers is more fixture-proof, so to speak, and he can get some good returns against anybody. That includes Everton away or Tottenham away, never mind the likes of Man City at home, where I urge people to start Morgan Rogers, even of a more expensive asset to, it might have been contentious to go for Rogers over, let's say, Fernandes that week, but he offers tremendous value, not to the same level as Cole Palmer last season, but still enough to be a talismanic figure for Aston Villa and also outscore a lot of more expensive midfielders and forwards in FPL. But let's go for 2 more kind of mid-priced options in this position, and one of them is Bruno Fernandes. He could be a placeholder for Bryan Mbeumo, although if you just want the better asset from the get-go, it might be worth going for the Brentford talisman instead. But Fernandes is facing 3 opponents he loves to play against in Southampton, Brighton and Fulham, so I could see him getting some massive returns in some of these matches, despite the fact that Brighton and Fulham aren't the easiest of opponents, but Southampton are still there for the taking despite having a new manager. We haven't seen that managerial bounce really, maybe in a few minutes against Crystal Palace when they took the lead, but that's about it. United could get a big win here if they actually turn up, but they're also so inconsistent. Ruben Amorim discussed this after the draw against Liverpool. Why can't they do this every week? Well, that's part of the problem that Man United need to solve, and this video is recorded before the FA Cup game against Arsenal at the Emirates, so that should be a very interesting one to see how they develop in that match. But let's complete this midfield with the most in-form option right now, and that's going to be Anthony Gordon, who has been outstanding recently. He also scored against Arsenal in the Carabao Cup semi-final, and he was one of the difference makers in that game. And in the Premier League, he's actually returning very consistently now. He was a great option for me in the last campaign, very frustrating when I owned him at the beginning of this season, but we are starting to see the best of the likes of Gordon and Isak as they're firing Newcastle into the top 4. Despite facing Liverpool this week, it is Southampton coming up very soon, and Chris Wood is fixture-proof, so I still think he's worth investment, although if you're buying a striker this week, I'd rather go for the likes of Jimenez instead, even Mateus Cunha arguably, but if you have to start Chris Wood this week, it's not the worst solution in the world, and he could get a goal and some bonus points, as he has done on multiple occasions this season. But there is one change to this front line, and that's going to be Raul Jimenez, who got 13 points against Ipswich Town, courtesy of a brace of penalties, and I discussed buying/holding him depending on the circumstances in my recent Wildcard and Transfers podcast, as I thought he was a very good option against Ipswich Town, and the same goes for the West Ham and Leicester fixtures, despite the fact that they are away from home. So he is by far the best Fulham attacker over Harry Wilson, Iwobi and Emil Smith-Rowe. There will be some rotation with Rodrigo Muniz, particularly in terms of being subbed off early, and we've seen that in the FA Cup as well against Watford in that 4-1 win. Jimenez got on the score sheet as well in the second half, and I think he's a decent option at this price. Probably by far the best option actually, below 6 million in the forward line. But let's go for the best option in the game right now in this position. I think he's only behind Salah and maybe Palmer in terms of overall form. That's going to be Alexander Isak, and a Newcastle triple up is still on the cards here. Maybe 2 is the sweet spot when you look a bit beyond the next 4 game weeks, but having Hall at the back and then this attacking double up of Gordon and Isak works wonders, especially for those that have done so in the last 6 game weeks, and I think it won't let up anytime soon. It's time for the starting 11, and Sells would be in goal, but you could definitely make a case for starting Fabianski instead. I wouldn't blame you if you just went for the West Ham shot stopper, and if he doesn't start, it's not a big deal. You'll have Sells come on for you anyway, and Jordan Pickford is still a great choice between the sticks if you haven't invested in him already. The back 3 would be Munoz, Gabriel and Lewis Hall, and the back 5 of Rodgers, Salah, Palmer, Gordon and Fernandes, with Jimenez and Isak up front. The captaincy is close. FPL Team do favour Salah, but at the moment I am leaning towards Isak, which I discussed in my Transfer Plans podcast. The bench comprises of Fabianski, Chris Wood, Mikalenko and Konate. You could swap the latter 2 and maybe put Konate second on your bench, but that's certainly up for debate, and maybe Gabriel can drop to the bench for some of you. And if you've got the likes of Brian Mbeumo, I'd be starting him in a lot of scenarios against Man City at home this week. It might be different though when he hosts Liverpool in Game Week 22. But with the captaincy, I would probably just keep it between Salah and Isak this week. Palmer is another great option, but Bournemouth are a better team than people still give them credit for, and they could go to Stamford Bridge and get a victory. But to conclude things, let's head over to Drafthound and see what they suggest for the best wildcard team. On the whole, it's a solid squad with the exception of Region. That might be a glitch in the system to be fair, but they've got Dubravka and Sells as the best goalkeepers, and I think that makes sense at this moment in time. The defenders include Trent, Tosin and Castagna, with Salah, Palmer, Gordon, Foden and Mbeumo, which is arguably the best midfield. Maybe you change Foden to Rodgers and then use those extra funds to kind of invest in other positions. Isak and Jimenez up front is what I've discussed in this video. They've also gone for Joao Pedro, who is an injury doubt, but I have covered that amongst other injury updates in my updated Transfer Tips podcast, so be sure to check that out. And they've also got Anderson and then Region, which doesn't make any sense to be fair, but the other 14 players in this wildcard team are great picks, I have to say. Even Dubravka in the short term, although as I said, I'd rather go for Lewis Hall to cover Newcastle defensively. And if you do have Trent this week, you'd still probably want to start him in any single game, even against Nottingham Forest away from home, despite their great form in recent weeks. There is a link to Drafthound in the description below. The same goes for all my social media platforms. But thank you very much for watching this video and listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, then be sure to smash the like button and subscribe for new. Our aim is to get this to a 200 likes and to keep on pushing towards new goals like 32,000 subscribers. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram, DylanRCM, and check all the links in the description below for my Patreon and the championships, for early access to my videos, amongst my other perks, the Discord server, FPL League Drafthound, as well as Spotify. I'll see you very soon for more FPL and news fantasy content. Keep your eyes peeled for that deadline stream on Tuesday.